Hey YouTubers, this is Rob Muffet. Today I'm doing something I've never done before. I've got over 225 videos, but this is my very first fiction movie I've ever put on YouTube. I've done a few stories, but they were more personal narrative and autobiographical. I wrote a short science fiction story. I added a bunch of photos in public domain to make a science fiction movie, and I think you're going to like it. If you don't have time to watch it now, save it and watch it later. And if you do have time to watch it now, it's a pretty neat story. I wrote myself. So get yourself a nice beverage, get comfortable, sit down with a nice snack, and watch the movie. And I recommend as a snack for this particular movie, buttered cinnamon toast. I hope you have half as much fun watching it as I did making it. Thanks, everybody. Maktumbe was very angry. His toaster would not toast. The fact that this toaster was over 200 years old may have had something to do with it, but that still did not make Maktumbe any less angry. The things that he had to do to get the toaster, and the ingredients for the bread, and the correct electrical power and all of its configurations had required him to lie, steal, and risk his career, life savings, and suffer the penalty of imprisonment or death should he ever be discovered. His damn toaster better toast. But it was broke for eternity. Maktumbe was regional district commander, and that did not require him to ever spend much time out in the field, but one day several years ago he had been on an investigation with some of his employees and discovered in the ruins of a distant part of the old city a storehouse buried under the rubble, with many items that dated back into antiquity. One of the most interesting things they found were bags of wheat in a dry storage room hidden away below in the frozen ground. Such things as wheat had been banned years ago, and the government now had stiff penalties and fines against anyone who bothered to manufacture or prepare their own food. All food now must come from the government for safety reasons. The government spent half of its national budget on furthering its biotechnology and genetics and bioengineering industry. It was an enormous amount of money. What was the point of creating the perfect person and model citizens through science and genetics if some Stone Age idiot was going to muck everything up with God knows what primitive food to upset the fine, delicately tuned balance of genes and bioorganisms? The world had been stunned to learn just a century earlier that mankind was ruled not by his brain, or even so much as genetics, although they did play a large part. What almost entirely governed and controlled mankind had turned out to be tiny microorganisms that lived in his gut. What made a man angry, or slothful, or ambitious, or lazy, or murderous, or magnanimous had largely been due to the fact of the type, quantity, and consistency of bioorganisms living in his upper and lower intestines. There was a riot of microorganisms living in his stomach, sending out a constant stream of hormones and biochemical triggers and inhibitors that to a large extent controlled its human host. Once science had figured this out, they determined it was safer for everyone if they used a manufactured food of constant and known ingredients and variables as better to control the effects of the microorganisms and delete most of their harmful aspects. Food production had been outlawed. Genetic engineering had been approved and championed to produce a human species most compatible with the bacteria growing in our guts. That gave us the most happy and prosperous and peaceful peoples. It was for our own safety. Food production had been outlawed, as had food preparation. Whatever you prepared or whatever you ate came from the government. Anyone caught growing their own food or plants or animals that were not licensed and approved by the state could be sent to prison or even executed. It was for the good of everyone. When Maktumbe saw the sacks of seeds, he knew what they were as he had seen them in pictures. His mouth became dry. It was the most evil thing he had ever seen, these bags of wheat. Only Allah knew what would happen if they got into the wrong hands. It was possible the seeds could still be viable. Imagine people planting and growing their own food. It was barbaric. Still, Maktumbe was drawn to these seeds. The fact that they were so evil and outlawed meant they had a sort of power which drew Maktumbe to them. He told his men he would destroy them personally, and he loaded them into his transporter and took them to the government center and nervously stored them in secret. He took them home a little bit each day until all of the evil wheat seeds were hidden in his home. From time to time, Maktumbe would take some out to look at them and think about trying to grow them or sprout them to see if they still held life in them. But the thought of it made him weak, as he knew how wrong that would be. But still, the wheat called to him. He had some copies of ancient volumes that showed how people had used this wheat. They had ground up the seeds into a powder called flour and made food out of it. Grinding up the wheat was sort of like destroying it, Maktumbe thought. What would it hurt to grind up just a little? Maktumbe read the old books which told of how they had used the flour and let it sit in the open air to attract yeast, wild yeast. Maktumbe thought this yeast was just like the microorganisms growing in his gut. If they were good for him, they should be good for this flour also. Maktumbe mixed the powder with some water and let it stand in a container for several days, and soon it started to bubble and thicken and emit the strong, yeasty aroma smell. Now, what was he going to do with this glop? Maktumbe had some of his workmen build a device that could hold a temperature of the required specific range, and he brought it home with him. There was almost no known reason why any human would need a device in his home that would create such heat, so it was difficult to explain. Maktumbe told him it was a government secret project in competition with their despised rival district, and the men complied. Maktumbe read the old text over and over, and when he got his heating device he began his experiments with his wet powder, with his flour, made from the wheat, and in a short period of time was astonished to have been the first human in several centuries to have actually made his own bread. The bread tasted good. It had a wonderful feel in his mouth. Everything the government gave him to eat was either soft and gelatinous or stiff and wooden, with no other alternatives. Nothing was flaky or crusty or crumbly or crackly. Nothing was velvety or crunchy. Nothing was gristly. Nothing fell to the floor in flakes or crumbles. Nothing tore apart and was stringy or chewy. It was either soft glop or stiff chewy, in assorted colors, with lots of sugar or extra salt, little salt or no salt at all. Maktumbe started making the bread every day. He loved to watch it as the yeast, which was wild that he had caught drifting in the air and now was being used to serve him. This made him laugh, as he knew for so long he had been serving the microbes that was inside him, and now the tables were turned. As time went by, Maktumbe wished for more. He wanted other things to add to the bread, but all such possibilities had ended generations ago. Maktumbe wondered if the yeast in the bread was affecting him. He had been terrified of this, because he had heard for years how eating food made by man could upset the balance of the organisms in his gut and cause strange or abnormal or perverted behavior. You had to be very careful with your behavior. Every day, Maktumbe walked to work. He was only allowed to use an official government transporter when on official government business, even though he was regional district commander. And even though he was regional district commander, he, like everyone else on earth, walked wherever they had to go when the distances were short. The government had learned that people could lie with their words, with their faces. They could lie with their emotions, and even control their brain waves to an extent, but for some reason, the complete body language of the human being as it walked along gave out certain signals which, if recorded on video and reviewed by a computer with the right algorithms and program, could detect an abnormal behavior of the person who did not have his mind right. Maktumbe knew he had to keep his mind right. His behavior had to be the same as everyone else's and not exhibit any differences or alterations. Every day on the way to work and on the way home, people were being monitored. It was for their own safety. If anyone exhibited any antisocial or anti-government or anti-biological movements or behavior, an inspection drone would come out to monitor them more closely, and if it looked as if they were not fitting in properly, they would be questioned there on the spot. This was for their own safety. If someone was getting ready to do something bad to another person, the government needed to know. You couldn't have people going around hurting other people or causing problems. If a person's behavior showed they were getting ready to do something bad, the government was there to take care of it. That's what the government was for. They were there to help. Maktumbe was a little terrified what this bread might be doing to him, but he continued to eat. But still, he wanted more. One day, Maktumbe was reading some of the old volumes. It talked about a device called a toaster that could toast the bread into something completely different. A tiny, faint image, a tiny, faint memory from the past made him think of something he had seen in the building in one of the old parts of the city years and years ago when he was very young, before he even joined the government, before he was actually even old enough to be outside into the old city, where he'd gone on a lark with the other children where they weren't supposed to be. He had seen something that was shiny and metal, and he had wanted to take it as it was so uncommon, but he didn't know how he would get it home without being detected by drones. Part of him thought to himself, this might be a toaster. It just didn't look like any toaster he had seen in any of the images that had appeared in the old volumes. Maktumbe thought he knew where it still might be. The next morning, he called in sick and told his department he would have to go to the medical terminal. Maktumbe walked the long distance to where his transporter was kept while trying to be sure he was not exhibiting any outward distorted disturbances or behavior that was abnormal. He signed out his transporter and left to the old town. Very little had changed. There was new plant growth that was somehow able to grow in the short warm season before the snows came again, and some of the buildings had collapsed more, but basically it was empty and abandoned. Maktumbe finally found the old building he thought was the one he had seen the shiny metal object in and went inside. In a brief moment, he found what he had come for. The metal object he had found was a toaster from the time period of the 1940s. To make it work, you put the bread on a rack on one side, and the bread moved along the rack on a conveyor belt and was toasted on the inside and came out on the outside all toast. It was an unusual toaster even for the 1940s. It must have been kept as an oddity or collector's item. The fact that it survived the centuries was amazing. Now the problem was, how in the world was he going to get this home? The drones would see him for sure. No one was allowed to walk around with something wrapped up. It was for their own safety. Why would you have something wrapped up? What were you hiding? Maktumbe had with him a small screwdriver, and he took it out and began inspecting the toaster, and wherever there were screws or nuts or bolts he began to disassemble the toaster. And when he finished, he took off his clothes and then tied each part of the toaster onto different parts of his body, and then put his clothes back on. If he was found out, he would lose everything. He would lose his position, his house, his money, his liberty, as he would go to prison, and if they found the bread in his house, he might even be executed. You can't have citizens reintroducing strange, new, unregulated, and untested bacteria and microorganisms into a person's body, as they had no way of knowing what would happen. It was for their own safety. Maktumbe got into his transporter and drove back to the city and left it at the transporter station. As he walked back to his house, he began to think of something to block his mind, something to focus on that would keep him calm and completely normal in the line with the people surrounding him. He began to think of standard operating procedures for utilizing document supplements or non-authorized transmission reports, those both occurring after the pre-submission date and those occurring on alternate pre-submission dates. Yes, this would do it. Document supplements and transmission reports would do nicely. Maktumbe walked confidently, but not too confidently, back to his house, and as he entered it, took off his clothes and reassembled his captured toaster with a smile. The 1940s toaster was a delight once he figured out how to power it correctly. You could put a slice of bread on one end, and it would slide through the insides and come out the other side a golden, toasty brown that crunched in your mouth with a delicious feel and tasted smell. Maktumbe now lived for toast. He didn't care what happened to his biointestinal fauna and flora. Unfortunately, even a 250-year-old toaster can only last so long, and soon the heating elements wore out, and Maktumbe had no way to replace them. This began a long, sad period in Maktumbe's life. There were a few moments on his way to work when drones had stopped and interrogated him as his body language indicated something was different. Was there a problem? What were his thoughts at that moment? Why was his patterns and behavior inconsistent? It was for his own good. It was for everyone's safety. Soon, Maktumbe was able to get back to normal and expected behavior as regional district commander. But one day, he went back to the old books and was reading them some more when he discovered that some of the people in the old days had used grain for things other than bread. Some of the people fermented the grain and made a liquid beverage. They called it beer. Maktumbe wondered if this would be as good as bread. He had the grain. He had the water. He could make or catch yeast wild floating in the air, and he had sugar too, although not in granular form. Maktumbe would have to try it. What would beer taste like? How would beer make him feel? How would beer make the microbes in his gut feel? And would the video monitors be able to tell he had been drinking beer? Maktumbe didn't care. This worried Maktumbe, as he had always worried about such things before. Maybe there really were bad bacteria in the bread and yeast. Maybe it was right the government prohibited people from making their own food and drink. Maktumbe had made bread. Now he was getting ready to make beer. But this is what Maktumbe wanted. And this is also what the microbes in Maktumbe's gut wanted Maktumbe to think. For you see, microbes do not live by bread alone.